So good afternoon and welcome, and thank you for participating today in this afternoon to our webinar in reducing Scope 3 emissions with Donau Soja. My name is Franco Petri and I'm head of communications of Donau Soja and will guide you through the next hour. Actually, we are pretty delighted at the moment because we have a record-breaking registration number for this webinar of more than 220 participants from 25 countries. So good afternoon is maybe the wrong word because we have also some participants from Chile and other countries in Asia. That shows us that these topics are burning and affect not only producers and processors in Europe, but also suppliers outside the EU, even throughout the world along the supply chains. The reason why we are all here is the global climate crisis and how we can tackle it. As part of this Green Deal agenda, the EU has introduced a new set of legislation with directives and regulations to reduce carbon emissions in the 27 countries, and also the supplier countries are affected as well. But also within the economy itself, broad voluntary market initiatives have been made to face this biggest challenge for mankind in this century. Well, the keys to tackle these new challenges are the carbon footprint calculations and climate transition plans. Donau Soja organized this webinar to help our partners with the topic how companies can measure and reduce their carbon footprint and how to report it. Today, we focus on Scope 3 emissions because Scope 3 is by far the biggest chunk of companies' emissions. A special emphasis will be put on possibilities to reduce emissions in animal-based products by responsible soya sourcing. Maybe you have heard about very cryptic acronyms like CSRD, CSDD, SBTi, FLAG, ESRS. All these cryptic acronyms will be much clearer, hopefully, after this webinar, as we will provide you an overview of what they mean. This webinar is a first step towards a better understanding of what is expected of large companies and their supply chains. But after that comes the real work. I think I'll share my screen for a moment. Yeah. And I want to introduce the speakers of today. This will be Daniel Fitz. Daniel Fitz is the Manager of Environment and Climate for the UN Global Compact Network, Austria. He will provide us with a bigger frame in view of the United Nations and the corporate sustainability, the CSRD and the SBTi. The second one will be Carrillo Diaz, Product Manager of Agri-footprint and the Global Fed LCA Institute, which is GFLI. And she's also a Blonk consultant of Blonk sustainability. She will talk about the Agri-footprint database for LCA calculations. Then we have, last but not least, we have Julia Weihs sitting next to me, Program Director of Standard and Sustainability of Donau Soja. She will explain us how Donau Soja and Europe Soja certified soybeans can reduce, can reduce, maybe even stop Scope 3 emissions. During the presentations, you can write your questions in the chat. Please address them to one of the speakers, so that makes it easier for us to direct your questions to the person responsible. And we will try to respond to as many questions as possible. Until all talks are over, and afterwards you can send us your question, or even during the webinar, you can send us the question of understanding, but also the questions you had during your registration process and during the webinar. Well, and I think I hand over to Daniel now. ID share here. Just a moment. So.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm very glad that I've had the opportunity to talk to you about European reporting frameworks and voluntary frameworks such as the Science-Based Targets Initiative. I'm going to jump right into it. First, a brief introduction of the company or the initiative I work for, the United Nations Global Compact, started in 2000 by Kofi Annan. And our main objective is to assist companies of private business to implement the 10 principles of the United Nations Global Compact, as well as help with the SDGs and how to manage around working with the SDGs as a private sector. Very important to mention that we're not a standard. We are only a framework to help companies connect better and to understand the 10 principles and implement them. Very briefly, we're a multi-stakeholder platform with over 21,000 business and 3,000 non-business. We're in 170 countries plus, and we have local networks in about 62 countries right now. I'm going to jump right into it. The mandatory framework, a lot of fuss is happening about it right now, and I'm going to specify it with the standards E1, that's the environmental standards. First up, the key requirements for the CSRD mentions specifically a double materiality, meaning companies need to focus on inside out and an outside in perspective, meaning looking at the impact of your company on the environment and vice versa, the environment on your company. As a cornerstone of the European Green Deal, they work with implementing the ESRS standards. ESRS standards are classified in environmental, social, and government topics. And another thing to mention is the third-party assurance that requires companies to provide a limited assurance in the first step, starting in 2026, to give information and to have an auditor or equivalent to provide proof that your data is correct. All right, that's the timeline. It's ever changing, as many of you might know. Right now, it's important to know that the bigger companies that already have to report according to the NFRD, that's, I don't know the exact number, but a good size amount already have to report in 2025 with the base year of 2024. But very important is 2026 as the first reporting year for large companies, and to have at least two requirements being met, listed here, to be falling under this requirement. Next up are the small and medium-sized enterprises, but the listed ones. They have the first opportunity to report is 2027, but with the opportunity to postpone it for up to 2 years. And the first reporting for non-EU country companies with net turnover over 150 million euros within the EU are required to report in 2029. What is the relevance for SMEs and suppliers? As I did not mention SMEs specifically that are not listed, it's very important to know that there is a drive by supply chain pressure, not just in tier 1, but further on as well. And they will hand over questionnaires regarding the sustainability performance down the supply chain and value chain. Those could be with carbon disclosure projects, CDP, or EcoVadis or equivalent. It's important to know that the market opportunities are severe and very, very big right now for companies to deal with those questions and actually think about how to provide them towards their supply chain, because it will be mandatory in the future. And of course, there's a customer pressure to provide those informations in the future. What actions can you take now to make your business ready for the upcoming changes? I listed a couple. They're not exclusionary. There are a lot more, of course, but start with educating yourself and your team about those issues. Start beginning to work with to make the first non-financial report. Even if it's not perfect, it will be important that you start, not start later on. Data collaboration and supply, as work with your partners along the supply chain to share data, share information is a very big help. It has to be in the last couple of years. And for standards, I can point out that the ESRS has a voluntary SME standard that is already in draft and is publicly available. I've had the link here, where SMEs can work with and have a reduced KPI data sets where they can look over what will be required in the future as a help for sustainability reporting. Another two things to mention is the communication progress from the UN Global Compact, also a framework that could probably help you. And the Global Reporting Initiative has a lot of guidelines how to work with the sustainability reporting in the future. Just a brief overview, those are the data points that are briefly mentioned in the ESRS E1 climate change standard. And I want to point out point 2, which is the policies target action plans and resources that explicitly refers to scientifically based and evidence-based carbon reduction commitments, which lead me to directly to my next point, the voluntary initiative for public commitment for carbon reduction, the Science-Based Target Initiative. As the Global Compact has been one of those initiatives that founded as a founding partner, the Science-Based Target Initiative, I have the honor to represent it here. Science-Based Target Initiative is a global body enabling businesses and financial institutions to set ambitious emission reductions along with the latest climate science, meaning IPCC mainly. Jumping into the next point, I know it's very quick, but I have a couple of minutes left. It's interesting to note that scopes, many of you might know the differentiation between scope 1 and 3. Maybe just very briefly, scope 1 is the emissions that are directly produced from your organization. Scope 2 include indirect emissions from purchases of energy, such as electricity or heat. And scope 3 can be categorized in upstream and downstream emissions, the main focus of today's webinar. That's just very brief. Here you can see an overview of possible data collections and forms that are relevant for each scope. You can probably look at them in hindsight, and you'll probably find another very interesting information. Setting a science-based target, that's the general criteria. A lot of companies are interested in what is the base year. Of course, the base year is shifting. The later you start, the more ambitious you have to be with your science-based target. For the flex sector, you can go up to 2028, and for other sectors, it's 2015 at the latest. For the base year, you have to set your base emission year. Then you have a target year, which can be the near-term target 2023 or the long-term target 2020, also up to 2050. So targets must cover a company-wide scope 1 and 2 emissions as defined by the GHG protocol, and near-term targets must reduce an absolute GHG emissions in line with 1.5 degrees Celsius. For scope 3 specifically, scope 3 screening must be completed for all relevant scope 3 categories with a GHG protocol along the value chain, accounting, and reporting standards. If a company's relevant scope 3 emissions are 40% or more, it has to include scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions in the near-term target. And at a minimum, you have to require a decarbonization up to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Also, very briefly, key methodology of science-based targets has the goal to have a near-term target and a long-term target. And very important to mention that carbon offsets are not being counted within this reduction. I mean, it's still encouraged and very much recommended that you do so, but that's only in addition to your science-based target. It's not being counted. There are a lot of cross-sectoral guidance documents provided publicly by the Science-Based Target Initiative, and specifically also for SMEs, which is a very much reduced route for companies to commit to science-based target. Coming to the flex sector already is very important that there is a flex sector guideline. Companies can commit to an absolute-based approach. I didn't mention that before, and a sector-based approach. Sector-based approaches are very much tailored to the sector. Most sectors are already being covered by Science-Based Target Initiative. And those two guidelines will be important. I have to mention the land sector removal guidance will be also, in addition to science-based targets, important for the flex sector in the future. Who sets the flex target and what are the key features? As mentioned before, there are two possibilities, the absolute-based approach and the sector-based approach, among others, of course. Flex sectors are land emissions and biogenic removals, covers them. Flex targets are separate from energy industry targets. And FLEC offers options on demand-sided and supply-sided companies. So there's an opportunity to have a sector approach and a commodity approach specifically for the FLEC target. I'm going to mention that in the next slide. And it's required for the FLEC sector to require a non-deforestation commitment as well. And again, no offsets will be included. Companies in any other sector than those that are mentioned here in this slide, FLEC-rated emissions total more than 20% of the company's overall emissions, scope 1, 2, and 3, will be able to use the FLEC sector sectoral guidance. And the last slide for me today covers the directs for today's webinar. Interesting commodity approach, specifically for soy, of course. If the companies with emissions associated with one or more of the available agricultural commodities pathways, then account for 10% or more of the company's gross emissions, then they can use one of those commodity approaches. In that sense, one of those mentioned here, and you see on the right side what a reduction would be in terms of percentage per year. I'm looking forward to your questions, and I'm thanking you for the opportunity for today's input. I'm going to hand it over. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Daniel, for this thrilling overview. And now we know what SBTi and CSRD and all the other acronyms mean so far. Could you close your presentation, please? And the next speaker will be Carolina Carrillo Diaz, and she will be backed by Jan Joris van Diepen. But the presentation you will do, Carolina, and Jan Joris will answer questions after the presentation's done. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. And Carolina, please start.
Yeah, so we're gonna discuss about Agri-footprint, and basically the reason why this is of interest to many of you, it's that, as Daniel was saying, scope 3 is part of the targets that are set for companies, and usually it's very hard to quantify. So I'll walk you through how you can use Agri-footprint for that. Yeah, a little bit also about us. We're Blonk Sustainability, and we have been working for over 20 years as sustainability experts for companies and organizations in the agri-food business. And we have been pioneers in the Netherlands, but also in general in the world in environmental footprint management. And we do that through consultancy, software, and data solutions like databases, like what we're going to discuss today. And they're all based on life cycle assessment methodologies. And basically, to be able to perform them in a consistent way, we are up to date, and we're participating also in the development and open feedback for scientific and international guidelines and methodologies to which our databases align. And we're really careful about greenwashing, and that's why we are very much characterized by being transparent, reliable, and very dedicated to our work. What else should I say? We support the entire food system value chain. So we don't only work with companies, we also work with governments, public organizations, universities, research institutes, etc. That's a little bit about us. Now, let me tell you about our database. Agri-footprint, it's the world's leading source of environmental footprint data for the agri-food sector, and that covers quite a lot of products in different locations. And they are relevant for actors within the feed market industry and food production too, mainly in terms of ingredients. But also we see growing interest from the biomaterial and energy industries. And our databases are not only used by LCA experts, which were our target group in the past, but now we see their growing use by companies that need emission factors to calculate their emissions. But well, of course, we also collaborate closely with them, but also with the scientific community and other parties that I mentioned earlier. And to explain a little bit more of what we have in the database that can be used for flag calculations, I think it's also useful to explain to you what kind of data that there is in a database. Basically, the largest part of the data that you can find in Agri-footprint is called secondary data. And what we mean by that is that it's data that is aimed at estimating the impact of a product based on everything that happens throughout its life until a particular point in the production chain. And usually the secondary data is based in statistical data. We also have branded data. And this means that some companies or some parties are interested on being a bit more specific about an actual production system or an actual product. And they are willing to share their activity data or how their production processes work to get a more specific estimate for their particular product. And there's also some sector data, which is basically an average data of a sector. And that's what's included in the database. And you'll see how that connects to the use in flag in a second. Besides our main database, Agri-footprint, we have a database, which is Agri-footprint flag, which is based on what I've told you before. But this is a specific version that is tailor-made to be aligned with SBTi flag guidelines. And what that means, you'll find in the box. You can check that later. It's a lot of methodological details. But it aims at making it easier to compile the inventory required for SBTi and set targets, but also monitor your progress towards those targets. And we see that most of our clients use this information for Scope 3 calculations for the purchased goods and services. And the database can support with the evaluation of hotspots and strategies towards improvement of the impact, so reduction strategies. But well, when people start working in these reduction strategies, it's also relevant to think of how those reduction strategies are being planned and how comparisons are being made when comparing the progress between the past and the future. So when there's a relevant contributor to the impact, basically in the baseline approach, let's say companies start evaluating how big their impact is due to a particular contributor through secondary data. So this one that I mentioned that was intended for, let's say, broad comparisons, screening and minor contributors. Once a contributor or a product or a service is noticed as a hotspot or a relevant contributor to the impact, it's recommended that more specific data is used. And that's where branded data that represents actual products becomes more important. So if available, it's recommended to use a specific data of the products that make the largest contribution to each company's footprint. And just as a note, this is still a developing guideline, as Daniel was saying, but there's a concept of rebaselining. And what that means is that when a clear difference in the methodology of the evaluation of the baseline and the progress towards the baseline occurs, it's relevant to bring back the two evaluations to the same standard. So it's still under definition, I'd say, whether rebaselining is required when you go from secondary data, less representative of your operations, to branded data. Branded data, you can check this a bit later, if more in detail if you want to, but branded data, as I said earlier, tries to disclose more information of a company's own operations, so it's more representative for products. It sometimes requires information of the whole supply chain because it's aimed at being more specific. And of course, all the data that goes into branded data is reviewed prior to discussion to make sure that the impacts are logical or representative. The impacts of branded data are free to access, but of course there are end user license agreements that are applicable, and they can be found in various formats. So the emission factors can be directly found in an Excel format, as you'll see in the next slide. But for more experienced LCA practitioners, it's also possible to find CSV files compatible with CIMA Pro regarding this branded data. And many different impact categories can be found. I think this is for later. If you're interested, you can check it. And we have different companies that are into the Agri-footprint branded data. One of them is Donau Soja, which has included flag contributions into their footprint, ProAgrius and Sodrugestvo. But we get more and more requests from private companies that want to get their products into the database. With Donau Soja, we worked in getting primary data, so data of the operations of the farms and the production processes for 90% of their impacts. So basically the impacts of the products that are in the database are quite representative of what actually happens in the farms. And per country, that means that information was gathered for multiple farms for many different characteristics of the production processes. For example, yield, use of fertilizers, use of fuels, and other services. And you can have a look at how the data looks like in the table below, and you can also access the data in the link that has been added on the bottom of the slide. And that's it. I'll hand it over again. Thank you. We can answer questions later.
Thank you, Carolina. Yeah, the questions, you have to wait a little bit more with your questions, but you can ask them in the chat, as I announced before. Yeah, I think there was a very deep insight into your databaseology, if you can say so. And I guess there will be a lot of questions coming up there. As the last speaker of today, I would ask my colleague Julia to talk about how Donau Soja and Europe Soya certified soybeans can reduce Scope 3 emissions. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Franco. Good afternoon also from my side. I hope you can see my presentation on the screen. Now that we heard about the regulatory and the methodological background, let's have a look what all of this has to do with soya. So for those of you who do not know Donau Soja, I will start with a short introduction of our organization. Donau Soja is a non-profit organization in Europe, founded in 2012. Our headquarters is in Vienna, and we have offices in relevant soy-producing countries in Eastern Europe. Our association comprises a network of 320 members from 30 countries, from the food and feed supply chain, but also from civil society, agriculture, and science. And together with our partners, with our network, we work towards a more sustainable protein supply for Europe. And if we're talking about proteins, we definitely need to talk about soya. So this is why Donau Soja is supporting our members and partners to address and work on sustainability challenges related to soy production and consumption along the value chain. And as we heard before, one of the biggest challenges of our time is climate change. So this brings me to today's topic. I assume that many of you are from the feed sector or soy sector, or somehow from that area. So maybe this is not new to you. But if we talk about soy, we are actually talking about big volumes. So if looking at European consumption, we see that in Europe, the average European person consumes 60 kilograms of soy per capita per year. Most of this, 90%, is consumed indirectly as animal feed. So we're talking here about hidden soy that is a big challenge. It is a big challenge because European agricultural systems are lacking legumes such as soya in crop rotation. There's only a few percentages, 2% of soya in crop rotation. And this is why self-sufficiency in Europe is relatively low. And the EU needs to import huge amounts of protein crops for its livestock production. Most of these volumes come from overseas, and this leads to a global imbalance that has severe effects on ecosystems in Europe and overseas, as well as on the climate. Let's look into the figures in more detail. The European Union is importing more than 34 million tons of soybean equivalents per year. Most of the volumes come from overseas, more than 40% from Brazil, from Argentina, and 16% from the USA. Major part of this goes, as we said, to the livestock production sector. According to the European Soy Monitor, in 2021, only a quarter of these imports was verifiable deforestation-free. And this deforestation, this comes at a high price. The International Panel on Climate Change estimates that deforestation alone is responsible for 11% of the global anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. And the EU has a major share in this. After China, the EU is the second biggest importer of tropical deforestation, and 30% of these imported emissions from deforestation are due to soya imports. So we see we have soya with high emissions, and this predominantly goes to the livestock sector as feed. So therefore, the carbon footprint of animal-based products is largely determined by the animal feed. This is why animal-based products are an important lever for setting science-based targets and reducing Scope 3 emissions. As we have heard before in the presentations of Daniel and Carolina, these Scope 3 emissions are the upstream and downstream emissions in the value chain that are not directly in the influence of a company. And the Science-Based Targets Initiative requires companies to set a Scope 3 target if the Scope 3 emissions account for 40% or more of the total emissions. In practice, this is very often the case because Scope 3 emissions usually make up the lion's share of a company's emissions. For example, looking at retailers, Scope 3 emissions often account for far more than 90% of overall emissions. And the overwhelming part of these Scope 3 emissions comes from purchased goods and services. If we stay in retail, these purchased goods and services also include meat and dairy products. And meat and dairy products are estimated to account for about half of the product-related Scope 3 emissions. So you can come to the conclusion that reducing emissions from meat and dairy are actually a big lever to reduce Scope 3 emissions overall. One obvious way to reduce meat and dairy emissions is to reduce meat and dairy products in the assortment and promote plant-based solutions. And another strategy is to reduce emissions of remaining meat and dairy products. So let's look at the carbon footprint of meat and dairy products in more detail at the example of pig production. In pig production, for example, feed, and especially soya feed, is the biggest factor. Looking at the overall carbon footprint, it can be up to half or even more of the overall carbon footprint. So feed, and especially soya, is a relevant factor, and by switching to responsible soya, emissions can be cut significantly. This can be further illustrated by the results of a study that was conducted in 2020 by the Austrian Institute for Organic Agriculture, which compared which did a study on the Edeka Premium Pork Program Hofglück, and it compared Edeka Hofglück pig production with Donau Soja Europe soya feed to a similar production system with overseas soya. And as you can see, the results show a significant difference. Pig production with Donau Soja causes 2.2 kilograms of CO2 per kilogram of pork, while a comparable production with soya from overseas would cause 3.4 kilograms. So only by switching the soy component, it was possible to reduce the emissions per kilogram of pork by 40%. This reduction is based on the low environmental impact of Donau Soja and Europe soya soybeans. These are the results of the study that was mentioned by Carolina before, where we conducted a big research project to collect data from Donau Soja Europe soya farmers in 4 European countries who produce soybeans according to the Donau Soja and Europe soya requirements. And these standard requirements include also a strict no deforestation and no conversion requirement, therefore leading to a significant reduction in land use change emissions, leading to a carbon footprint of 0.3 to 0.4 kilograms of CO2 per kilogram soybeans, which is significantly lower than, for example, average Brazilian beans, leading to a reduction of up to 90%. So you can see that switching to certified deforestation and conversion-free soya can significantly reduce emissions. These data that we have developed in the project is also available, as was mentioned by Carolina before, in relevant LCA databases, such as the GFLI and the Agri-footprint database, and it's also integrated in specific tools to calculate animal-based product carbon footprints, such as the Sostel tool. And this database can then be used by interested companies to calculate footprints and also set soil-related science-based targets. And of course, the data is also available if you contact us directly. So summing up and coming to the end of my presentation, if you're setting climate targets, I would recommend to look into your soya value chain to estimate the soy footprint and then consider setting soy-related targets. Of course, if you would like to set up projects with responsible soy, we are also here to support you and to connect you with suppliers or to engage with suppliers. And we hope with this contribution, we could provide you with useful impulses for tackling Scope 3 emission, specifically in the soya value chain, and also to spark a discussion and the exchange of data and information along the value chain. With this, I would like to thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your question. Handing over to Franco again.
Yeah, thank you, Julia, for this overview. I think it's pretty clear now what Donau Soja Europe soya can do good for you when you're in the animal feed business or in the animal product business. And I'm looking over to my colleague now and to the monitor, and we have about 6 pages now of questions coming in during this session, and also before this session, and also on LinkedIn, because we're also broadcasting this webinar on LinkedIn. And I think I would go to the first question now, and the first question is directed to Daniel. To what extent are CSRD, Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, Science-Based Target Initiative, and FLAG target legally binding to cooperations? To what extent?
Thank you. Yeah, well, to be honest, I was anticipating this question. It's on a lot of companies' mind. What is the legal binding part? First off, on the European point of view, there's no sanctions or monetary sanctions planned as of now. There could be in the future, of course, and there are talks about up to $10 million euros sanctions, but as of now, there are no sanctions from the European Union. Of course, we have to take into consideration that the reports will have to be under limited or reasonable assurance, meaning that if they're not correct, you have the possibility that there are legal consequences from the companies that have to check your sustainability report. Of course, it's very important to consider the possibility of a reputation loss from your competitors and your customers, of course. And customers are likely to even sue the competitors in the future for promoting false information. It's also interesting, the recent development that France, for instance, took the opportunity to have the CSRD mandatory by law. So there are sanctions for French companies specifically, but I'm not aware of Austrian companies, for example, that have done the same. That's for the CSRD part, the European part. The Science-Based Targets Initiative will have no reasonable or monetary consequences. If you commit to the Science-Based Target Initiative, you have 2 years from the commitment to publishing your science-based target. If you fail to do so, you will be listed as a company that has not provided information and will be publicly listed as non-reporting. You can, of course, withdraw your science-based target at any time. You again will be listed in the global database as company who retracted their science-based target. And for FLAC, coming back to the differentiation between sector-based approach, FLAC in that case, or absolute-based approach, as of now, the majority of companies committed have the absolute-based approach. And it's up to the sector to use the sector-based guidelines that are specifically tailored to the needs. And for many companies, it's a lot of help to use the sector-based approach. As they're now being rolled out over the years, we see more and more companies use the sector-based approaches. But I can maybe tell as well that the science-based targets will in the future maybe have an annual review of your target. There are no such regulations as of now, but there's a possibility to strengthen the credibility of the science-based target to have an annual review. As of now, it's not reviewed after being said. So I hope this answers a couple of your questions. You can go a lot more in detail, but yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. Let's come straight to the next question, and this question is directed to Julia Weihs, because it is coming from the chat directly. What are the major challenges in increasing traceable certified soy within Europe? Do you expect a surge in Donau soya, Europe soya volumes in the coming years?
Thank you very much for this question. We do see indeed increased demand and increased requirements for traceable segregated deforestation-free soy. On the one hand, because of the EUDR, the EU deforestation regulation that was mentioned, and also because of the additional benefits for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So if we look at availabilities, for example, in Donau soya and Europe soya, at the moment, we have prepared the volumes for 2023, and we have an availability of more than 1 million tons of certified Donau soya and Europe soya beans available in Europe at our more than 900 partners. from the value chain. These are on the one hand collectors and processors. So there is indeed big volumes that are not fully demanded yet, but I see that there is additional demand upcoming. So yeah.
Okay, I think that's a direct answer. I tried to bundle the questions now. The questions go to Carolina and Jan Joris. It's a fourfold question. Maybe you have a pen, or if you forget them, I will repeat them afterwards. The first question is, what are the impact categories in the Agri-footprint database? Second is, how complete and reliable is the data on land use change and water? The third is, do you have data on biodiversity as well? And do you plan to build also organic data sets? So whoever of you both wants to answer.
Yeah, I think I can take it. If you want to say something pressing, then Doris, feel free. Let's start by the impact categories. Basically, all the data sets in Agri-footprint are based on the LCA methodology. So we gather inventories of everything that is required to produce a material. That means that as long as it's possible, you can calculate all impact categories available, for example, in the recipe method or in the EF method, which includes water footprint, land use, eutrophication, acidification, ecotoxicity, everything that's included in either of those impact assessment methods can be calculated.
Biodiversity as well?
Yeah, so I was moving on to biodiversity. Biodiversity, it's actually an endpoint category, which means that it's affected by many of these intermediate impact categories that I mentioned before. It is part of the recipe method, therefore it can be calculated for our database. But I do have to say that the impact assessment methods developed for certain of these impact categories like ecotoxicity or biodiversity do have some limitations. We have some information in our website about this. For example, the way terrestrial species are addressed differs from the way marine species are addressed. So if you're very interested in the subject, I would encourage you to have a look. But in short, yes, it can be calculated. And the last part was on organic. Oh, sorry, I skipped to the part of land use change and water use. So for land use change, we do use, and for water use, we do use models that use available statistics from FAO to estimate land use change. So they're representative at country level. Of course, for example, for Donau Soja, we did use information about the specifics of the farms that were captured by the study. So it's reliable, but of course there could be differences between the actual sourcing of particular material and the average in the database. I can post where you can find more information if you're interested in learning more. We do adapt to the PAS 2050 standards. And in the case of FLAG, we do linear amortization to calculate land use change. And for the last part on organic agriculture, we're not currently planning on including it because there are no standards that are globally accepted to address certain big issues regarding organic agriculture. For example, the value of manure within organic systems. But it is in our in the future of the developments we want to include once more consistent and widely accepted standards are developed and published.
Thank you, Carolina. And then I have a question to Daniel. I think that will be interesting for the smaller companies, not the big with the big TNCs. What are the simplifications for small and medium-sized enterprises if they want to set a science-based target within the initiative?
Interesting question. I guess it's good to hear that the scope 3 particularly has not, well, does not need to be covered for the reporting if you're a small and medium enterprise. There are set reduction percentages, and you can choose the base year, but one of five options, and equivalent reduction paths for scope 1 and 2. But scope 3 is not mandatory for SMEs. Of course, it's encouraged to also track it and report it, but it's not counted to your science-based target. So that's also a big relief for many SMEs. Of course, I can also mention that for the ESRS and the European reporting standards, it is currently in development to have a simplified data set for listed SMEs as well. So I forgot to mention that specifically, that there will be a reduced data set for listed SMEs. And just as the draft for other SMEs that are not listed is already publicly available, you can see it's significantly reduced in complexity. If you look at the originally published ESRS standards, they can be intimidating, to be very fair. The data sets and KPIs are out there, and even for seasoned, experienced sustainability professionals, it is quite the feat to get a handle of all those KPIs. So I hope that answers the question for the SBT as well.
Yeah, thank you. Next question goes to Julia, and so we stay in the rotation. If you compare Donau soya versus Brazilian soya, okay, that's an echo. How does this help with future legal compliance in the EU if you think of the concrete measurable impact of soy feed? So comparison Donau soya versus Brazilian soy.
Yes, thank you for the question. As I presented also in the presentation, compared to the average country data, there is a significant reduction possibility because the Donau soya and Europe soya data sets that show 90% less emissions than the average Brazilian value. And since the data sets that we have prepared together with Blonk consultants are aligned with the PEF methodology by the European Union and also with the GHG protocol for SBTi, these data can be used in current regulations such as the CSRD and also the CSRD, the due diligence directive that is also upcoming. And these upcoming legal requirements state that companies need to set science-based targets and to prepare science-based climate transition plans. So by making use of these opportunities of reduction and by using the data sets to calculate these reduction possibilities, I would say that there is a big opportunity here also to make progress in the soy sector and reduce emissions that are imported.
Okay, thank you, Julia. As we are coming slowly to the end, I think we have time for 2 more questions. This is a question to Carolina. How does soy compare in terms of sustainability to other sources, such as pulses or oil seeds? Carolina, maybe you can explain about the data in your database.
Yeah, so it's a very big question and it touches upon many points because as someone also commented, there's quite some contributors to what affects the impact of a crop, and they have to do, for example, with the efficiency of the production. So we know that for some crops like soy, the nitrogen required to grow them is lower than for others. So in that case, for example, fertilizers have a lower impact than in other crops. Also the efficiency of the systems that are producing them, but land use change is a very big subject. And usually when we work with crops, you make the difference of between them. And this is often more related to geography than to specific crops. So there are many factors to take into account when comparing the impact of different crops. And yeah, I don't have therefore I don't have an answer that fits all the categories, right? It's really product specific, and country specific because of all these factors.
One quick answer maybe from Daniel to the next question. Maybe it's only one number, a 4-digit number, it's a year. How long may calculations of the eco-footprint date back from the entry into force of the CSRD and the SBTi?
So how long, but which year you mean?
Which year, yeah? Can you go back a decade, or is it just a cutoff date?
It is a cutoff date. I'm not 100% certain on the specific year, but it should be 2015. The correct information, unfortunately, I cannot tell you right now, but the data sets, the cross-sectoral guidance documents published by Science Based Targets will be referring to it. I think I mentioned 2015 in the presentation as well, so it should be 2015.
All right, thank you, yeah. I think we don't have time anymore for another question, right? If I look at our colleagues, it's 59. And I think, yeah, thank you very much for participating today. We all hope this webinar cleared up the sky a little bit of the challenges to come. You will soon get an email from my colleagues with all the links and presentations and also the recording of this webinar. In this email, you will also find the contacts. Of course, you can go back until you get this email. You can always come back to us, to my colleagues, the 2 speakers, and the 3 speakers actually. Just write us an email, and yeah, in the mail, in the registration mail, you will have the contact already, but the precise contact you will get in the email of my colleagues afterwards. Yeah. Anyway, I wish you a nice afternoon, a nice evening from Vienna and to Europe at the moment, and also good morning to the other side of the world. And thank you for participating today.